One of the things we speak about in this week's parasha is the prohibition against stealing. And it's different in our parasha to Lo Signov in Naser Sadibros, which is talking about kidnapping. Here we're talking specifically about stealing items. That brings us to the Gemara Sanhedrin, the siyum of the Gemara Sanhedrin, where it talks about the idea of the Ir Hanidachas, the city of idolaters that has to be destroyed, not only the people, but all of the possessions. What happens if somebody steals, in other words, takes one of those items which are not allowed to take? And from that, the Gemara, firstly in the Mishnah and then in a Brisa, goes into a discussion about the anger that is brought into this world from theft and how theft is comparable to idolatry. Now we need to understand why. Why would you compare theft to idolatry? And why does it bring this unusual anger into the world? We're also going to note some nuances between the way the Mishnah says it and the way that the Brisa says it. And effectively the message is going to be that there are certain averos that have a long-standing impact even after the person has no longer continues that particular behavior. The impact still exists in this world. And that's going to teach us an important lesson generally about how serious it is to steal, but also more a general lesson about the concept of teshuvah. As long as a person hasn't done teshuvah for something, there's a certain anger in this world, as we shall see. When you compare lo signov, do not steal in our parasha, to lo signov, do not steal in Naser Sadibros, he said, the Gemara Sanhedrin tells us, so we know that our parasha is speaking about a person who steals money or possessions, whereas Aser Sadibros is davar alomed menyona. You look at the context; these are all capital offenses, and so there it's talking about kidnapping. So we're going to focus in on the idea of stealing. So it's with regards to stealing money that it says in this Gemara in Sanhedrin. Any person who steals, it is akin to serving idolatry. Now, we don't just use rash descriptions to compare things because we want to say how serious they are. If the sages chose this particular comparison, it's because there must be a similarity somehow between stealing and idolatry. Because we know that Chazal are so pedantic in their choice of words and so selective, move on. So for sure, when the Chachamim say that a person does a particular avera, it is like doing idolatry or something similar. They're not just trying to show us this is such a serious avera. It is as serious as if you served idolatry. Instead, the Chachamim want us to appreciate that there's something about this Aveira, some theme of this particular Aveira that is similar to the theme of Avodah Zarah. Even though you could say that in a general sense about every Aveira, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. The truth is, the truth is that every Aveira that a person does is somehow similar to Avodah Zarah. As the Alter Rebbe explains in great detail in Tanya, that lo yelecha is kol shasam mitzvot lo yisaseh, that the second mitzvah in the Aser Sadibros, don't have any other gods, in other words, Avodah Zarah, incorporates within it every single prohibition in the Torah. Why? Because at the end of the day, any time that a person does an avera, you transgress chas v'shalom something that Hashem says, that is a form of idolatry. That's a form of rejection of Hashem's absolute sovereignty. Now, if that's true for all averos, that they all have something in common with Avodah Zarah, rejection of Hashem's supreme authority, so then if over and above that we find that there are certain averos that the Chazal say they are akin to Avodah Zarah, that immediately tells you that there's something about these specific averos that is even more like Avodah Zarah. So here in the Gemara, when it tells us that stealing is like Avodah Zarah, it means stealing is more like Avodah Zarah than any other mitzvah which is already like Avodah Zarah. So we have to understand how can stealing, which is effectively a transgression between humans, how could that be akin to Avodah Zarah, which is a direct rejection of Hashem? So that's what we're going to have to explore. What is it about stealing that makes it so similar to Avodah Zarah? So to understand this, we'll look very closely at the end of Sanhedrin, where the Gemara highlights something that shows just how serious Geneva is. So the Gemara tackles something the Mishnah says. The Mishnah quotes the pasuk about an irani dachas, where the Torah says you shouldn't allow your hand to come into contact with anything of the spoils of irani dachas. It all has to be burnt. Says the Mishnah, so the Mishnah says, as long as there are Rishoyim in the world, Hashem's anger, chas v'shalom, is directed at the world. Once we remove Rishoyim from the world, which apparently is talking about the Ovda Avodah Zarah, you would think, but in a moment we'll show that's not the case. So as long as there are Rishoyim in the world, there's Hashem's anger in the world, get rid of the Rishoyim and you remove Hashem's anger. So the Gemara then comments on that Mishnah, Man Rishoyim, who are the wicked people we're talking about over here, who we have to remove in order to dispel Hashem's anger in the world. Amar Rav Yosef, Ganvei. Rav Yosef says that these Rishoyim who bring Hashem's anger into the world are Ganovim. Now, we have to understand something. We have to understand what the Gemara was asking, and we have to understand what Rav Yosef answers. Aleph. Ma mokem lishoil besil mesechtes Sanhedrin. Man Rishoyim laach shalosh and Rosh mefir kvar b'tanach kama v'chama piyamim umedubar be'inyan ikri b'shakla b'tarish b'prokim hakoyin b'sechas zay. Why are you only asking what a Rasha is? Who's a Rasha? The Gemara says, who is a Rasha that the Mishnahs talk about? Now you ask. This is the end of Sanhedrin. So much of Sanhedrin spoke about Rishoyim, and so much of Tanakh discusses Rishoyim. Now, Eresh, at the end of Sanhedrin, you asking who are Rishoyim? And base ma'atir shayman ganva lo kol ha'ever aloises and ikirasha k'moshe lamadu kvar le'il shepasul le'edus. Plus, how can you say that a Rasha is a Ganav when Sanhedrin itself, the Gemara Sanhedrin, listed ways in which a person is a Rasha, and pretty much any transgression of a mitzvah loisaseh makes a person a Rasha who is disqualified as a witness. So what's going on over here? The question seems so late in the game, and the answer seems so specific, where the Gemara itself has already spoken about a Rasha in very broad terms. So Biru Mefarshim, so some of the Mefarshim say that because the Mishnah that we're analyzing over here is a Mishnah that's basically talking about an irani dachas. And the pasuk that says don't touch any of the spoils so that Hashem will redirect his anger away from you was also because the entire context, both of the Mishnah and the pasuk it was quoting, is all in the context of irani dachas. So now you have a question. What do you mean that Hashem is angry as long as there are still Rishoyim in the world? Doesn't make sense, because you would have thought the Rishoyim are the idolaters of the irani dachas, but that's impossible. You can't explain that we're talking over here about the wicked people of the irani dachas. Because the pasuk that says don't touch any of the spoils, which is the pasuk about Hashem's anger, that happens after the pasuk that tells us kill all the inhabitants of irani dachas. That means we've already dealt with the sinners of idolatry and they're no longer alive. So who are these other Rishonim that we're talking about? That's the question that fueled the Gemara's dismay. Which Rishonim are you talking about? So which Rishonim are we talking about after the Rishonim of idolatry have been killed, as the Torah requires? Who are these Rishonim now that keep Hashem's anger in the world? So that's what Rabbi Yosef has to say in this particular context, despite all of the other definitions of Rasha that we've seen prior to this point. In this specific context, we're talking about Ganovim. These are the Rishonim who bring Hashem's anger into the world. In this particular context, even after the irani dachas has been destroyed. Meaning, Hakavoni Hilele Shagonvu Min Acherim Mishal irani dachas. Which Ganovim are we talking about? Those who illegally took spoils of the irani dachas, because everything is supposed to be destroyed. You're not allowed to take anything. So those people who took spoils for themselves, those are the Ganovim. They are the Rishonim in this context. They're the ones who bring Hashem's anger into the world. וזהו שלמד מן הכוסף ולא ידבק ביודך מיומה מן החרם למען יושב השם מחרן אפו. Now you can see the flow. Don't touch any of the spoils so that you can remove Hashem's anger from the world. Meaning, שכל זמן שקיים בעולם הראשון שנוטלים מן החרם, יש חרנף בעולם. So the implication is clear. As long as these guys who took spoils for themselves, the ganovim of this story, are still around, then Hashem's anger is in the world. So now we get it. Yes, of course we know what Rasha is, but we need to contextualize in this specific context, and we understand why the Gemara is asking a question, because we thought we got rid of the Rishonim when we killed the Anshe Ir Anidachas. Now we know there are another group of Rishonim, the people who help themselves to the spoils of that city. It's not straightforward just yet. Okay, so let's ask Rav Yosef, why are you calling these people Ganovim? Surely the Torah over here is not addressing ordinary theft, it's addressing specifically those who took spoils out of an Ir Hanidachas, which the Torah says you may not do. So then Rabbi Yosef should really have chosen language that would match better with what they've done wrong. What they've done wrong is not classical theft. What they've done wrong is dafka, taking from the spoils. So Rabbi Yosef should have said that. Who are the Rishoim? The people who take the spoils. And even technically, taking those spoils is not technically the normal definition of theft. It's an avera, yes. It's not really theft. Who are you stealing from? Who did it belong to? The people who these possessions used to belong to are now all dead. You can only steal if you're stealing from somebody. So the prohibition against taking these spoils is because there's certain things the Torah says you may not benefit from. So there's a lot of halachic discussion and debate whether or not this has anything to do with theft. Even though you will find in both halachic terminology and in Torah itself that we refer to people who take spoils they may not take as ganav. That was Hashem's rebuke of Yoshua, that Achan had stolen from the spoils. He hadn't actually stolen, he had just helped himself to spoils that he wasn't allowed. But of course, all of those just tell us that the word geneva could be used with regards to taking spoils. So one of the So it seems really odd that Rav Yosef makes it sound as if the whole issue over here is the stealing, which it isn't. The whole issue over here is disobeying Hashem. It says you may not help yourself to the spoils. So why is he calling them ganovim? Almost as if to say there's something about a ganav that is a unique kind of a rasha that brings Hashem's anger into the world. And this gives us the opportunity to discuss this issue. Why? Why ganovim? So one of the ways that will help us to understand it is we'll look at the difference in language of how the Mishnah tells this particular story, and then the Brisa that follows, which tells almost the identical story, but not really. But Brisa Isa, the Brisa says, Tana Rabbanan, Rasha bala olam, Charoin bala olam. So the Brisa says more generically, a Rasha comes into this world, Charoin, Hashem's anger comes into this world, and it quotes a pasuk from Mishlei, Shenema b'voy Rasha boy gam buz v'im koloin cherpa. The pasuk says when the Rasha comes, so there is this disgrace that comes, and with the rogue, so there is this also kind of a disgrace, this embarrassment that comes into the world. Then the Brisa continues, Rasha ovad min ha'olam tova ba'a la'olam. Once we are rid of a Rasha from the world, that brings goodness into the world. Shenemar, as the pasuk says about avoid Rishoyim Marina, that when there's the loss of Rishoyim, there is rejoicing in the world. Umesayim be'Brisa, the Brisa then ends with a comparison that on the opposite end of the spectrum, Tzaddik ba'al olam toiva ba'al olam. When a tzaddik comes to the world, that brings tremendous goodness to the world. Shenemar, like it says, that Noach kind of brought a pause to all of the bad behavior that had happened at that particular point in time. So generally speaking, if a brisa is more wordy than a mishnah, that's totally normal. because it's a Mishnah Siddur Rebbe K'moshe Kosav Rambam Bekotzim Milei Davar Kotzel Kelul Inyanim Rabim. When the Mishnayos were composed by Rabbi, as the Rambam writes in his introduction to Mishnayos, everything is very succinct, minimalistic words to convey many and complex concepts. Brises are the next generation down, where the intellectual ability had diminished. So they needed more information and more support from psukim to the concept. That's why brises generally have a lot more discussion than the Mishnahs do. You find that very often throughout the Shas that certain topics are given in very short presentation in Mishnah and much more detailed in the Brisa. So generally speaking, if the Brisa tells us more than the Mishnah does, and this Brisa brings psukim as proofs, that's absolutely fine. But there is something strange over here about the Brisa, where the Brisa almost looks as if it does the opposite. What does need to be explained is how come over here the Mishnah and Brisa seem to actually work against their normal operating system. Because L'shoina Mishnah hi charoin af, when the Mishnah talks about the anger that Ganovim bring into the world, it uses a longer expression, charoin af. Remember, Mishnah is usually shorter. Whereas when you get to the Brisa, it shortens it and just says charoin, anger, without charoin af. Now why? Why is there a distinction between them? It might seem like it's nitpicking, but it's really not, because as we shall see, there are two very different messages conveyed here. But first, either way we look at it logically, the Brise's choice of word does not seem to work. If the Brise is following from the Mishnah, it should say the same word as the Mishnah, charoin af. And if it's not referring specifically to the Mishnah, and it's trying to compare the Rosh and the Tzaddik, then charoin doesn't work as a word anyway. So anyway you look at it, doesn't make sense. If the intention of the Brisa was to use language that follows on from the Mishnah, then the Brisa should have also used the full expression charoin af. And if the Brisa actually built its entire presentation on the pasuk that it was going to quote, so the pasuk doesn't say the word charoin. If anything, the Brisa should have then said, when there's a rasha in the world, there is bad in the world. And that would be kenigud l'lashenu amura legabe rasha avad min olam tova ba'al olam. That would actually work as a nice contrast to what the Brisa itself says. When a rasha leaves the world, good comes to the world. So you should have then said, when a rasha enters the world, bad comes to the world. So once we analyze the nuances and difference between the Mishnah and the Brisa, it will help us to understand a lot more about a Ganav and why it is specifically that a Ganav is the one who brings this tremendous anger of Hashem into the world, and why Rav Yosef used this opportunity. Although the Mishnah was talking specifically about the Irani Dachas, Rav Yosef wants to use this as a great excuse to talk about how bad a Ganav is. So the explanation all hinges on this the difference between the Mishnah and the Brisa. It's not just a word difference between the Mishnah and the Brisa. There is a completely different content conveyed by the Mishnah and by the Brisa. Mishnah is sekes birani dachas, and we made a gamsi ma Mishnah, but yidbak biyot chomum min acherim shekol zman shoshem beilam charin af boilam. Hakavona hi lechet irani dachas shachet chomum biyosef avodah zara. At face value, the Mishnah, before we get to Rav Yosef, the Mishnah is talking about a very serious scenario, an irani dachas, an entire city, the majority of a city that began to serve idolatry, the greatest rejection of Hashem, and therefore obviously that brings tremendous anger into the world. That's the pshat of the Mishnah. That's why the Mishnah dafka uses the expression charoin af, because as the Rambam tells us in Moreh HaNevuchim, the expression charoin af is typically only used with reference to avodah zarah. So now that we're talking about this horrible avera of avodah zarah, the Mishnah wants to dafka use the word charoin af. Whereas the Brisa didn't specifically say that it was talking about the Irani Dachas or Avodah Zarah. It was talking generally about the principle of a Rasha and what a Rasha does to the world. The reason why the Brisa is not addressing Avodah Zarah is because Avodah Zarah is a rare Avera, specifically Ir Hanidachas, is so rare that it's unheard of. And especially nowadays, because we know the Gemara in Yuma tells us that they got rid of the inclination and the drive, the temptation for Avodah Zarah. It's no longer an issue for us. Therefore, the Bryce is talking about Rishonim Bichlal. The Bryce is just talking generally about Rishonim. That's why the Bryce has started off its conversation by saying, if there's a Rasha in the generic form, any Rasha in the world, not an idolater, that brings anger to this world. That's why the Bryce is happy to use the word charoin stam, not charoin af. Charoin af is a heavy word, it's an intense anger reserved for Avodah Zarah. The Bryce, unlike the Mishnah, is not talking about Avodah Zarah. So now we're seeing that there's a big difference. The Mishnah is focused on the story of Avodah Zarah and the extra anger it brings to the world. The Bryce is focused on a generic Rasha and the ordinary anger that it brings to the world. Let's not say that the Mishnah and Bryce have nothing in common. They do have a common thread. But the Mishnah said, as long as those horrible Rishonim who served idolatry are in the world, there is this intense anger in the world. Similarly, he who calls man she'eshasha yesh charoin at this man she'berasha of min ha'olam. So what's similar is that the Mishnah says, as long as those Rishonim who serve idolatry are in the world, there is this intense anger in the world. Likewise, the Bryce is saying, as long as there is an ordinary Rasha in the world, there's the ordinary anger in the world. That is the nekuda mishutefes, the common denominator between the two. They're both conveying that as long as the evil remains, so the anger that accompanies it remains. The Mishnah is talking about one kind of very intense evil and therefore very intense anger. And the Bryce is talking about a generic evil and therefore a lesser anger. Now that in itself raises a question, and this is the important question that we're going to have to try and use to understand what we're supposed to be learning from this entire conversation. If the we get it in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about this harsh Aveira, Avodah Zarah. So we get it. As long as that Avodah Zarah is not eradicated, we understand why there's so much anger in the world. As the Sifri says clearly, as long as there's any Avodah Zarah in the world, there is charinaf. There's this tremendous anger from Hashem in the world. But we don't understand the Brisa. If the Aveira that a person does, which qualifies them as a Rasha, is not so earth-shattering, it's an ordinary Aveira, why do we believe that Hashem's anger lingers after the Aveira is over? The person is no longer doing this thing. Why is there still anger? And that's the key that we want to understand. Why would Hashem's anger, so to speak, linger in this world if the action is over? It's not like the Avodah Zarah that's still sitting there as, like in your face kind of rejection of Hashem. The person did an Avera, they spoke Lashon Hara, they ate treif, they broke Shabbos, whatever it was, it's done, it's happened, it's not happening. That's what we need to understand. That explanation is, Midiuk l'shein Mishnah calls man shehara shoim ba'olam v'chulei. Note, the Mishnah and the Sifri almost look like they said the same thing. The Sifri said it clearly, as long as there's Avodah Zarah in the world, Hashem is angry. But the Mishnah changed it. The Mishnah said, as long as there are Rishoyim in the world, Hashem is angry. Why did the Mishnah make that change? After all, the Mishnah is talking about Avodah Zarah, it is talking about an Ira Nidachas, it is talking about Charoin Af, which is specific to Avodah Zarah. So why did the Mishnah say Rishoim, as long as they're around? Do you hear that? Not as long as that bad behavior or that icon of Avodah Zarah is around. As long as they are around, Hashem's anger is there. Why? Why did the Mishnah say that? Mochach shelefi Mishnah, Hacharin Af, eini rak mipnei shadayin yeshno metzir shel Avodah Zarah chayim ba'olam, ele b'glal ha'rishoyim she'over al hachet hashayich l'Avodah Zarah, be'ovra malo isa v'lo yidbak b'yod chomum u'min acherim, be'zois afilu b'shal shachet tzad acherim kvar einu b'metzius. Fascinating what the Mishnah is saying. Obviously, what the Sifri says is true. If there is an actual avodah zarah around, Hashem is still angry. Comes along the Mishnah to say, not only that, but even if a person took an item from the Irani Dachas, they didn't take a getchka, didn't take an idol, took an ordinary item from the Irani Dachas, that makes that person now a Rasha. Even if we, the Beis Din, come along and take it away from them and put it back and burn it and get rid of it, that Rasha perpetuates Hashem's anger against the world because of that behavior, and we need to understand why. The That was the Gemara's question. I get it. The Mishnah is telling us something, that even after the Avodah Zarah is gone, there's a kind of a rasha that could perpetuate the anger that was associated with that Avodah Zarah even after the Avodah Zarah is ended. What kind of an action could that be? What kind of a rasha could have done that? That even after we've destroyed the city, killed the people, gotten rid of all the Avodah Zarah, there's still a perpetual rasha that still keeps Hashem's anger aglow. Who is that? Rabbi Yosef Ganvei. To that, Rabbi Yosef says, I'll tell you who it is. It's the Ganovim who took things from the Cherem, from the spoils of that city that they should never have touched. Says Rabbi Yosef, these Rishonim never served Avodah Zarah. They had no kesher previously to Avodah Zarah. How did they enter the space of Avodah Zarah? When they took something that the Torah said is off limits, because it had belonged to Oivdei Avodah Zarah. The cave and Shadav and Asabation Shagneva, in a Kolzman Sharisham Ba'ilam, Charinaf Ba'ilam, Hainasha, Hacharinaf Nimshach Afil Achasha, Kfanis Bar Acherim, Va'ovar Mina Oilam. Because these people became engaged with this Avodah Zarah through a process that is technically Geneva, even though it's not maybe halachically Geneva, but because they took something which didn't belong to them, so now you've removed the whole Avodah Zarah, but you haven't removed the Geneva. Their problem is still here. Their effect is still here. Their anger that they initiated in the world remains in the world. We've removed the anger that the Avodah Zarah created, but the anger they created by ignoring Hashem's instruction not to touch those spoils, such anger is still here. Why? So Hezber Advarim, the explanation is this. Isu Gneva Gzeile yesh b'choyme miyuchad b'yosef pe'ula nimsheches. What is unique about theft is that when a person steals something, God forbid, until such time as they reconcile, at such time as they resolve the theft, give back the item, pay their dues, the Aveira perpetuates. As we're going to see in a second, that there are two ways you could view the concept of Geneva, and we dafka view it in a particular way, halachically, that helps us to understand what is so unique about Geneva. Hatam shemina Rambam olavin loy sigzol v'loy signoi v'bichlal lav shenitin letashlumin v'loy bichlal lav shenitin klasei. The Rogatchover points out something so fascinating. There are various kinds of averos that you can have, right? Mitzvahs loy say negative transgressions. Some of them are what is called lav shenita klasei, which means that it is a transgression, but it is linked to a positive commandment. Usually the positive commandment is how you correct it. That's one category of averos. The Rambam does not list stealing in that category, even though once a person steals, they have a positive commandment, that you have to return what you've stolen. So theoretically, you would expect it to be in the category of a transgression linked to a positive mitzvah. The Rambam does not categorize it that way. He rather categorizes as lav hanitin letashlumin, a transgression that you have to then compensate for having transgressed. Let's say that we categorized a transgression as linked to a positive commandment, then the Aveira happens at the time of the Aveira. Later on, when the person fulfills the positive mitzvah, which is to neutralize their transgression, at that point the transgression is retroactively neutralized. Get it? So the person did an Aveira on a Tuesday, and by Thursday they did the positive mitzvah that is supposed to correct that Aveira. we now consider that already from Tuesday that Avera had been neutralized. Mashenkin b'gneva gzela. Ha'adam over alalav kol zman shelo yishilem. Now that the Rambam categorizes theft or stealing as a lav hanitin l'tashlumin, that means the person did the Avera on Tuesday. From Tuesday, they became obligated to return the stolen item or to pay the penalty that is associated with the stolen item. They didn't. Now it's Wednesday. That means the whole of Tuesday and Wednesday, they've perpetually done the Avera of not repaying what they had stolen. By the time they repay on Thursday, it doesn't retroactively neutralize what they've done because it's been one long Avera over the course of all of the time that they refused to return the item. So memela kasha meishev sakneva v'agzela ein ze lav shenitn letashlum behoive ein shemikan la bo lo yavor v'nimsek sapula nimsheches avein adova metakein es halav shebeovar. And that's the important consideration over here. When a person eventually pays the reparations for having stolen, at that point they stop doing the avera, but the avera continued from when the theft occurred until the compensation occurred, even if that's over many years. It's a perpetual avera. That is what is unique about stealing. It is a perpetual avera until it is resolved. Which helps us to understand what this Mishnah in Sanhedrin is teaching us. Now that we know that theft is a perpetual avera and it remains in play until the person pays the money back, שגם בשעה אחר מהנידחס איננו, עדיין נמשך אצל הגן והרישוס של פעולת הגנבה, שהרי לא ימצאנו שהם שחפו לו רק עד לספס אחר. So now look at the scenario. Normally, a person steals, that avera continues until they return the object that they've stolen. But in the case of a person who takes from the cherem ira hanidachas, even if the basin comes and confiscates it from them, but puts it back into the pile and burns it with the ira hanidachas, we have nowhere in Torah that says that that person's avera is now resolved, because they don't voluntarily compensate. They're not fulfilling. There's no mitzvah. It's not nita klasei in any way. There is no positive mitzvah that says if you took something from the cherem of Eir Anidachas, you are obligated to return it. So therefore, from the moment they help themselves to those spoils, they are doing a perpetual avera that remains in play pretty much indefinitely. ומאחר שהריש הסיפור לנמשכת מקנבס החרם של הנידחס עבודה זרה, הרי כל זמן שהרשויים בעולם, היינו שעדיין לא יעשו תשובה על גנבס עבודה זרה, גם אחרי נפט עבודה זרה נמשך בעולם. That's what the Mishnah wants to tell us. As long as those people are still rishoyim, as long as they have not yet done teshuvah for the fact that they should never have taken from the cherem ira nidachas, their avera continues. And because the avera is not an ordinary theft, it's a theft linked to avodah zarah, which brings charoin af into the world. So the anger that they precipitated by taking from that cherem is alive in the world until they do teshuvah. Now the Brisa, as we know, is not talking about as intense a story as the Mishnah is. We know that. So the Mishnah is clear. Here is somebody who engaged in avodah zarah, therefore they began a process of a charoin in this world. They haven't yet done teshuvah, even though whatever they took was confiscated from them and burned, but they haven't done teshuvah, so they perpetuate this charoin ba'olam. The Brisa is talking about a lesser case, an ordinary rasha, but not a completely divorced case. There's something about an ordinary rasha which is similar to this intense scenario of the person who steals from or who takes from the cherem irani dachas. In the Mishnah, we are dafka dealing with a scenario where the physical entity that was avodah zarah is gone. All that's left is the person who sinned, who is still in a state of rasha because they haven't yet done teshuvah. That theme is something that you can identify in any avera, including the majority of averas, which are not ongoing averas. What is similar? There's no question about it that when a person does any avera that it might be, at that exact moment, that person now has an obligation to do teshuvah. From the moment of the avera, they are required to do teshuvah. So every single moment that goes past that the person does not do teshuvah, even though they're not perpetuating their avera, but they are perpetuating the fact that they're not doing the mitzvah of teshuvah, which began at the moment of the avera. So similar to the avodah zarah, right? To Geneva. In Geneva, as long as the person hasn't compensated, hasn't returned the item, they perpetuate the avera. Similarly, from the minute a person does an avera, they are obligated to do teshuvah. As long as the person doesn't do teshuvah, they are transgressing their responsibility to do teshuvah. This is the part that the Brisa teaches us. When there's a Rasha in the world, there is anger in the world. As long as this person still carries the title Rasha, which means they haven't yet done teshuvah, they perpetuate some level of anger of Hashem in this world. And this Brisa didn't get into the specific of which Avera are we talking about, because this Brisa is talking generically about the idea of Averas. The calls man shenimshach hedekim mitzvah tshuva nimshach gam acharo in beifin tamidi, as long as in the scenario of any Avera, as long as there hasn't yet been teshuvah, there is this perpetuating of Hashem's anger in the world. How could you not have done teshuvah? Now we can understand in an even better way why Geneva specifically is the one that is so similar to Avodah Zarah. What is Avodah Zarah? In the same way as we saw with Avodah Zarah, that as long as Avodah Zarah lives, so Hashem's anger is kindled against us. And it's called as long as there's the concept, certainly the items of Avodah Zarah in the world, there is Hashem's anger. So that's what's similar to Geneva, as long as the Avera perpetuates, just like Avodah Zarah, as long as it perpetuates, so Hashem's responsive anger perpetuates. As long as the Geneva perpetuates, so Hashem's anger perpetuates. Mashenkin shar averos, which is not identical to any other avera. Even though every single avera, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, has a tiny inkling of Avodah Zarah in it, because it is rejectionism of Hashem, still, so in any ordinary avera, all that perpetuates is you haven't yet done teshuvah, you haven't yet addressed the issue, which elicits some level of anger. But Geneva is the one that's like Avodah Zarah. You keep the avera going. As long as you haven't given compensation, that avera is alive. But there's still a question that we have to ask, and this question is going to help us to even fine-tune better how Geneva is similar to Avodah Zarah. Aleph, lama nokat Rav Yosef ganva v'legazloni or ganva v'gazloni. Why did Rav Yosef specifically say ganovim, thieves, and not ganovim and gazlonim, thieves and robbers? Why did he home in specifically on Geneva? Also, Beis mipnei ma l'shen abraisi chorim ba'la'olam v'loi ra'a ba'la'olam shu ha'hefech miteva ba'la'olam ha'omer agabe tzadik ba'la'olam. Why didn't the Brisa, when it talks about a tzaddik, it talks about goodness coming into the world? When it spoke about a Rasha leaving the world, it said goodness comes to the world. Now the opposite of good is bad. Why didn't the Brisa say when a Rasha is in the world, then there is bad in the world? Why did it have to say choron, which is anger? Which brings us to the next question. Gimel harei choron chomer yosem ira stam. Choron implies something which is even more intense than just bad, like something bad is in the world. Choron means something agitating, something infuriating. So what is it about Averos that brings more than just badness into the world, like fury into the world? Why? So in order to understand this, we have to look at what is the difference between a ganav and a gazlan, psychologically. It's a pretty well-known Gemara. The students asked Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, how come it is that the Torah is more strict with a ganav who effectively breaks into a home when nobody's there and steals, and now has to pay double what he stole, unlike a gazlan who steals in broad daylight in front of others and only has to return the object that he had stolen. Why? So Rabbi Yochanan explained to them it's because the Ganav has this incredibly bad perspective on the world. Because the says, look, the Gazlan, he might reject the fact that Hashem is watching, but he doesn't care about people either. Whereas the Ganav has prioritized people over God. Let nobody catch me. That's worse, and therefore his rejectionism of Hashem is why he has to pay extra. Has Berzeh Moisif Tam Betirutz Shrav Yosef Shakavonas Amishna Birushaim Agor Mecharina Fila Gan Veistam Ibli Lasker Shanid Nucherim get some Chetak Nebu Kein Avodah Zarah. Now we get it why Rav Yosef wanted to say not just the specific scenario described in the Mishnah, somebody who took from the Cherem of an Ira Nidachas, but Rav Yosef wants to expand it out to say all Ganovim are in a sense like Avodah Zarah, and Dafka a Ganav, not a Gazlan. Because the idea of stealing at night, in the dark, on the quiet, is a form of Avodah Zarah. Haganav afu sover ki lo'ozav Hashem ha'sa'aretz ve'ein Hashem royev v'lochen gam alidei gan ve'bo lo'inu me'ein ha'charinaf shal alidei Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is they wish to step back from the world and delegate it to other forces. Ganav, Hashem step back from the world, he doesn't watch what's going on over here, it's okay as long as nobody catches me. It's a similar, smaller version of Avodah Zarah. That's why the Brisa says that when a person does an Avera, it's not just that something bad comes into the world, but Charon comes into the world, anger comes into the world. Why? Because every Avera is a miniature version of Avodah Zarah. Any time that a person does an Avera, they're effectively making a statement that the Eibusha doesn't see me. He's too aloof. Like the pasuk says, a person thinks they can hide in the most secluded places, and Hashem says, "You think I won't see you?" In fact, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who we've just quoted, this is the famous kind of last will and testament that he told to his students, where he said, He said to them, Halavai, that your fear of heaven should be as great as your fear of people. So the student said, that's it? That's the big advice you have for us before you leave this world? He said, if only people would be able to live up to it. Teidu, know how people work. The nature of people is when they do an Avera, they say, please God that nobody see me. Or as they say colloquially, the 11th commandment is, thou shalt not get caught. Now we get why the Brisa says that the retribution for any Avera is Hashem's anger, because Hashem responds to us in kind. Like the pasuk we already quoted earlier from Mishlei. That if the person is a Rasha, what do they bring? Disgrace. If the person is a rogue, what do they bring? This rejection. Because a person doing an Avera effectively disgraces Hashem as if to say, you can't see what I'm doing, so it's okay. That's why the response that one gets from Hashem is anger. Now, even if the person has done, the Avera is past tense, as long as they haven't done Teshuvah, that anger still perpetuates. That's the point. As long as the person doesn't do Teshuvah, the person is still perpetuating their belief and their perspective that Hashem doesn't see what's going on. So it's okay, I don't have to reconcile. And that was the Brisa's message. That doing an Avera is to reject the fact that Hashem is present and sees everything. And not doing Teshuvah perpetuates the same thought, the same psychology. So if doing an Avera, so to speak, angers Hashem, as long as a person thinks, I'm okay, I don't have to do Teshuvah, they're prolonging Hashem's anger. So kiyadua lesima shamaseches is kesher b'shayches lascholas hamaseches v'af lishmo sheklolas hamaseches v'lachin nog lekasher behadran esim hamaseches lascholasa. We always know that the beginning and end of a masechta are linked, and this particular sicha is a hadran completing the masechta Sanhedrin. So we're going to look at a link between what we've just learned from the end of the Gemara to what it says in the very first Mishnah. Go back to the very first Mishnah in Sanhedrin. Over there it talks about Sanhedrin, all the details of how the basin should be constructed and how it should work, etc. Starting with with the fact that if you have a normal civil financial suit, it goes to 3 judges, all the way up to the greatest, biggest court cases which have to face a Sanhedrin of 71 judges. Obviously, each different kind of court will only judge on the particular laws that are relevant to be brought to that court. One thing that is common to the whole system, the whole legal system in Judaism, is that our courts are not only there to deal with crimes once they've been committed and to remove the perpetrators from society, but a core responsibility of the courts is to prevent averos in the first place. Like it says in Tanit Ve'Eliyah, a very well-known quotation, that one of the things of the Sanhedrin, not just the local magistrate's court, the Sanhedrin themselves, one of their responsibilities was the Sanhedrin, it says they had to literally get off their seats and roll up their tunics and walk all over Israel to educate the community to prevent crime. But when you think about it, it's really surprising. We know all the qualifications that you had to have to sit on the Sanhedrin. Incredible Torah scholarship, impeccable character, tremendous insight and wisdom. And the location of the Sanhedrin was inside the Beis HaMikdash. And the minute they're outside of the Lishkas HaGazis, they no longer have the status of the Sanhedrin. How then does the Torah expect that they're going to chain themselves with these iron chains and get out there and educate the people? How does it make sense to take the elite, the creme de la creme of the Jewish community, move them away from the Lishkas HaGazis, the most incredible place where they carry the stature of Sanhedrin Gedolah, and send them out to Ekwelt, to these little shtettlach, to start educating Jews who might need to be warned, don't steal, don't murder. So that was introduced at the beginning of the tractate, and at the end of the Masechta we get the answer. Because if there's a Rasha in the world, that brings Hashem's anger to the world. And the end of the Masechta teaches us, not only at the time of the crime is there this anger in the world, but it is a perpetual impact on the world until such time as it is corrected. Not only is it something which continues time-wise, but it spreads space-wise. As the Mishnah and the Brisa said, the anger comes into the world. So here's an individual who's done their Avera in their little corner. So of course it perpetuates in their world until they've done Tshuva, but it's more than that. It perpetuates to the entire world. The whole world is contaminated, but this person's Avera. Every single one of us is impacted by that individual's Avera. Even these wonderful, great, illustrious people who sit on the Sanhedrin, they are infected by the Avera that somebody did who knows when, the end of the world. וממילא move on, שמוטלת עליהם חייב ואחרייס להבטיח שמלכתחילה לא יגיע מצב שיגרום חרם בו לעולם. Now you get it. Now you understand why they have such a tremendous responsibility to make sure that this never happens. That such an avera should never happen. They've got to get out there and they've got to do everything in their power to prevent chas v'shalom such an avera, which could have such far-reaching impact both in time and in the world and on the whole community. And with that we can understand another principle. Everything in Torah is a lesson for every single one of us. So then what's the lesson for every single Jew from the principle that a Rasha brings anger to the world and a tzaddik brings goodness to the world? Don't tell me that it's just because the Torah wants us to know how bad it is to do an avera because it gets Hashem really angry. Or to tell us that good things are really good and they bring you goodness in your life and reward, etc. You don't have to tell me that this Mishnah is there to highlight how bad it is to do an avera and what consequences may follow and how great it is to do a mitzvah and what reward comes as a result, because the Torah has already told us that in tremendous detail. The Mishnah and the Brisa in tandem are teaching us something absolutely exquisite. A person who chas v'shalom does an avera can very likely think to themselves, I know I have to do teshuvah, and I will do teshuvah. I promise you I'll get there. But why the pressure? Why the rush? So the person will say, listen, I'm going to get to do teshuvah. In the meantime, I have other things to do, and some of them are really good things. I have some really important things to do. Why should I have to do teshuvah right now? There's other things. I've got projects and outreach and learning and davening. Yes, me, she'achlit lasis davar tov mitzvah. Or on the other side, a person knows that they should do a mitzvah, and they confirm, they take a resolution that they're going to do this particular mitzvah, and then say, but just not today. I'm going to get there. I have other things to take care of. I am getting there. In other words, there's a very common attitude of procrastination when it comes to both doing teshuvah and undertaking new mitzvahs. That's what the Gemara wants us to understand over here. That's not a way for a Jewish person to behave. In fact, that is against Judaism. Why? It's asur. Because as long as a person hasn't done teshuvah, the entire world is now subject to the anger that they've brought into the world. As long as a person has not done teshuvah, it's not just them who may have some negativity to tackle. The whole world is on fire because of this. And obviously the same applies in the opposite direction when a person does something good. When the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Brisa over here talk about a tzaddik, or the Brisa said a tzaddik comes into the world, doesn't mean a tzaddik of the Tanya's definition. Tzaddik means somebody who's doing the right thing. When you do something positive, it doesn't only benefit you, it impacts the entire world. It upgrades the entire world. And in an ongoing fashion. Therefore, when a person considers the fact that my choices have such far-reaching impact, then a person realizes, I could right now remove Hashem's anger from this world. I could right now bring more goodness into the world, not just into my life. It's not just my personal business. There's no question that has to wake a person, shake a person. And that for sure will push a person to make a good resolution to do teshuvah immediately and to take on that new mitzvah immediately, and that will bring goodness to the world. And like the Rambam says, it's like the whole world is hanging in perfect balance, and that next Pu'ula Tova can bring Geula, Yeshua, Hatzalah, Loi Ulachol Ha'ilam Koloi to us and Mitzvah to the whole world. We should be zoicha that our next action is that action that tips the scales and brings Moshiach immediately.